Well, thank you very much to making me part of this whole, project, and I am so lucky to be here with you this morning to speak in 15 minutes about a diverse tradition like Islam, is almost impossible. But I do want to make clear that whatever I say, there is an alternative interpretation. Whatever I say. If I'm representing some kind of liberal voice, then there's also traditional voice that comes from me at the same time. So I'm caught between what we call secularity and scriptural ethics. In a way, that's what I've been searching. Canadian Muslim societies, I say societies, are various and they come from different backgrounds, different national traditions, different histories. Although they are part of the same community, their histories are so different. And therefore, any attempt on my part to oversimplify Canadian scene of what's exactly happening among the Muslims in Canada will be premature if I don't say that this is only one of the many views about that society that I'm talking about. I can say this much, there's a lot of tension in the Muslim community at the moment, struggling to come to terms with living as a citizen in a modern nation state like Canada that is quite liberal, and entertaining those values which are not that liberal when it comes to family relationships, when it comes to communal ethics, when it comes to relativity, with the claim of absolute values that must touch all Muslims, whatever backgrounds they come from. Therefore, you find that the voices about human rights are various. There are those Salafis, that is the fundamentalist Muslims, who do not believe in the modern human rights language at all. They regard that language as an innovative language that is going to do away with traditional values, do away with what we call the essence of being religious, being related to the community, having an identity that is purely religious, and yet it seeks out to live a public life. Then there are those who are apologetic about it, because they're laboring under what I call triumphalist theology. We had a great past. We had a great civilization. We ruled the world at one time, as they would say it. And therefore, we cannot accept anybody's hegemonic control over our culture. So when they come to Canada, they have those baggages with them. And therefore, they are not at ease in deciphering their role as citizen in a new nation state. They are still laboring under the triumphalist theology. When they had the power, when they determined their own destiny, and now there's someone else determining it. You can see the conflict arising in the family values, conflict arising in gender relations, conflict arising between parents and the children. And all of it is played out, by the way, in miniature form or sometimes in a maximalist form in Canadian society. You just have to visit different centers. To add to this difficulty, we have the third major group, controlled by the traditionalist leadership. That's not homegrown, by the way. So they come from different parts of the world. So we have Saudi preachers, we have Libyan preachers, we have Iranian preachers, we have Pakistani preachers in Canada, and they all are teaching religion to the communities here. If you go to every mosque on Friday, you can hear different sermons at 1 o'clock. That's the source of guidance. Whether people follow it or not, I don't know. Majority might not even listen. This silent majority is worth taking into account, by the way, when we talk about human rights. The scriptural language of Islam is very much secular. This is surprising because we don't have a church. There is no authority that represents human institution in relationship between God and humanity. Each human being has a direct line to the divine. It doesn't go through the mediators. So there's no church. Therefore, there's no clergy, there's no cleric, there are no sacraments. The challenge is different. In that case, there's a challenge of jurisdictions. Who determines my relationship with God? Do I have freedom to negotiate my own spiritual destiny or not? If I have the freedom, then why does the institution that is not a church functions like a church to control the way I think? Can have a fatwa against me, can have a decree against me, can stop me from speaking in public in the mosque. How can they do it if there is no such institution? See the dichotomy that we are dealing with when we deal with the actual scene on the ground. So that kind of understanding about secularity is not actually has been lost in the historical Islam. So let's talk about historical Islam for a minute. Historical Islam functions as a source of identity of the majority of the Canadian Muslims. There's a history behind it. Who was authentic leader? What was the authentic tradition? Who provides with this sense of authenticity? These leaders are, as I say, they're not homegrown. Therefore, then, most of the information is relative. They come from either Arabic sources or Indian sources or African sources. Depends where the Muslims are coming from. Nigerian Muslims have a different understanding of their identity. If you go to Pakistani community, they have a different identity and different relationship with that past history, which is totally Arabic. It speaks about the Arab greatness. It speaks about Arab philosophy. It speaks about Arab Hellenism. Like my Jewish colleague says, we have this Greek heritage deeply involved in Muslim theology. And that's the expression we find. So when we come to human rights, one of the greatest challenges we are faced with, and I'm not simply an academician living in my ivory tower. No, that's not what I do. I'm engaged in increasing the awareness about the wrongs and the way women are abused in the Muslim societies in general. So my function has been to hold workshops for Muslim women, to empower them with religious information that they can use against male chauvinist jurisprudence. It is male chauvinistic, where the male jurists are determining what a woman needs, rather than a woman telling us what is her situation and what she needs as a woman. I work on bioethics in Iran, in Saudi Arabia, and other places. And there's always this problem of not involving women in their own situations. So the situation of the women is determined by men. And that's a violation of human rights of the women. So we have been fighting this battle of what I call arguing for the human dignity of a woman first. First and foremost, a woman, Muslim woman, is a human being. And therefore she has the dignity. And that dignity is inherent as a human person. Then comes all the other external qualifications that attach to her. I'm also talking about the rights of the minorities. I worked on the Iraqi constitution. I was one of the members of the advisory board of the Constitutional Committee that was appointed by the American government. And I worked very closely with some of my colleagues in Iraq, with whom I had studied at one point. But now we were colleagues working on the human rights situation. The problem is that Sharia does not have a concept of citizenship. It simply talks about men and women as believers and non-believers. There's a middle category of the peoples of the book. Those are second-class citizens. They are not full citizens. So you really have discrimination properly authenticated through the scriptural references in the Sharia itself. How do you overcome that? That has been my challenge. So when we were working in the actual situation of Iraq, my argument was that Sharia law cannot become the law of Iraq, because Iraq has different nationalities living in it. There are Christians, there are Sunnis, there are Shias living. And therefore, when they live together, they need something different to get them their equal rights. It cannot be religiously defined. Religion would certainly discriminate. We need something else. And I was able to convince my colleagues that that something else is actually in the Quran itself, when it says there is no compulsion in the matters of religion. That's what the verse of the Quran says, La ikraha fid din. There's no compulsion in the matters of religion. In that case, then, all human beings have a right to the freedom of religion, to the freedom of conscience. And I think I have succeeded in many ways to influence also the Canadian Muslims, but my influence is very limited, because there's a fatwa against me. I cannot speak in the Muslim communities, especially Shia communities. I cannot speak to them. The only community that tolerates me is the Iranian community, or the Iraqi community, or the African community, but not the Indian South Asian community, which is thoroughly living in the past of triumphalist theology. When that will change, I have no idea. But that's the challenge for the human rights, to get that legitimacy for the international documents. Thank you very much.